Hi, these are the most interesting historical photos that I could find. Let's go! A paper from the World Trade Center lies in the dust, and a man stops to read it. This was photographed on September 11, 2001, just after pages from the towers blew across lower Manhattan. Lake Peigneur looked calm, then a drilling mistake turned it into a giant whirlpool that swallowed a rig, barges, trees, and part of the shore. In one of the strangest twists, the nearby canal reversed and poured salt water back into the lake. 3 men crossed more than 4,300 kilometers from Nigeria to Spain, hiding on the rudder of an oil tanker. They survived 11 days above the Atlantic with almost no food, no shelter, and waves just below their feet. In 1934, a Swiss photo claimed to show the Tatzelwurm, a strange creature from alpine legend that people described as part cat and part snake. The image caused such a stir that a major German magazine backed an expedition to look for it. In 1937, this photo showed Geneva Peel, a 10-year-old girl, being sent back to her husband after a judge refused to cancel the marriage. He was 24 years older. In 1992, Annette Herfkens survived a plane crash in the mountains of Vietnam and woke up trapped inside the wreck. Rescue came 8 days later, and she was the only person found alive. In 1971, Senator George McGovern stands inside the wreckage of a Saigon nightclub hit during the Vietnam War. 1 year later, he ran for president as one of the strongest voices against the war. In 1916, Mexican rebel Fortino Samano posed calmly for a photo just before facing a firing squad during the Mexican Revolution. In 1971, Green Beret Captain Richard Flaherty stood beside a much taller soldier, and the height gap looked almost unreal. He was only 4 feet 9 inches tall and about 97 pounds. In 1981, players lined up in London for the Atari Space Invaders Championship, turning a video game into a public contest. It was one of the clearest signs that arcade gaming had become a real craze. In 1917, British soldiers laid wooden duckboards across no man's land at night, where one wrong step could drop a man into mud or open ground. Even this simple job was deadly because they were building a path in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. This old San Francisco photo shows people lying inside an opium den, one of the hidden places tied to the city's underground past. It captures a world that was once kept behind closed doors and rarely seen by outsiders. This 1922 photo shows a night initiation of new Ku Klux Klan members in Washington, District of Columbia. The glowing cross and white robes made the scene look unreal, but it captured how openly the group gathered in public at the time. At Rukuhia in New Zealand, rows of corsairs were left standing like a silent graveyard of warplanes. What looks like a parking field was really a final stop for aircraft that had survived the war, but not its aftermath. In 1944, Auschwitz staff were photographed laughing and relaxing just outside one of history's darkest places. The image is so chilling because it shows how ordinary people could enjoy a normal moment beside industrial mass murder. In 1964, a teenage Alan Rickman was photographed rehearsing for a school play years before becoming a screen legend. Long before Snape and Hans Gruber, he was already stealing the scene with that unmistakable smile. A German warplane lies nose down in the sea while the crew cling to the wreck and wait to be pulled out. The photo feels almost unreal because one wrong flight path ended with the whole machine standing upright in open water. In 1915, Italian Alpine soldiers climbed near vertical rock with rifles, packs, and ladders during the First World War. Mountain warfare was so brutal that entire units had to fight where one slip meant a fall into open air. This photo shows a man trying to hypnotize an alligator at a Los Angeles attraction once filled with around 1,000 of them. For decades, Lincoln Heights had one of the strangest sights in the city: a full alligator farm hidden in plain view. In 1916, sailors wounded at the Battle of Jutland were photographed aboard a hospital ship with their faces wrapped in heavy bandages. The masks make the scene look almost unreal, but this was the human cost of the largest naval battle of the First World War. On March 24, 1945, Operation Varsity filled the sky with Allied aircraft and paratroopers east of the Rhine in the largest one-day airborne drop in history. The scale was so huge that the sky itself seemed crowded with war. In November 1942, P-38 fighters were hauled through the streets of Noumea like oversized cargo on their way from the port to Tontuta airfield. It is a rare wartime scene where advanced combat planes look strangely ordinary, rolling past shops and pedestrians. In 1942, workers cleaned and repaired a Chicago and Northwestern E-4, one of the most striking Art Deco steam locomotives ever built. Its smooth shell made a steam engine look like a machine from the future. The second Curtiss XP-55 looked like a plane from another world, with its strange backward shape and canards at the front. It was one of the boldest American experimental fighters of the war, built to test if a radically different design could fly better. This street truck sprayed DDT, a chemical once praised for killing insects and slowing diseases like malaria and typhus. What looked modern at the time later became infamous because the same chemical was found to linger in nature and harm wildlife. In 1959, Marilyn Monroe and Jack Lemmon posed on the set of Some Like It Hot, one of the most famous comedies ever made. The photo is extra memorable because Lemmon spent much of the film disguised as a woman, while Monroe became its unforgettable star. In the early 1930s, used cars were advertised for as little as $29, with some up to $189. Even in the middle of the Depression, the promise of owning a car was already being sold as an everyday dream. In December 1972, astronaut Harrison Jack Schmitt paused on the moon with the American flag, while Earth hung small and bright in the black sky. It is one of the last human photos from the moon. This rare photo shows Kim Il-sung from an angle North Korean images usually avoided because of a large growth on the back of his head. Even one small detail like this was tightly controlled, which makes the image far more revealing than it first looks. In 1987, one of the first big Adidas shoe shipments reached stores in Yerevan, turning sports shoes into a real event. In the late Soviet years, imported brands like this felt rare, modern, and instantly desirable. In 1918, sheep grazed on the White House lawn, as if the grounds were part farm, part symbol of wartime America. During the First World War, the wool was used for military needs, which makes this quiet scene far stranger than it first appears. Olympic champion Betty Robinson was mistaken for dead after a plane crash and was taken to a funeral home before people realized she was still alive. A few years later, she returned to racing and won Olympic gold again. This 1910 photo shows a man in a hydroelectric bath, one of the strange medical treatments once sold as modern science. Machines like this promised healing with water and electric current, even when the real results were often doubtful. This 1918 dental X-ray setup looks more like a machine from a nightmare than a medical tool. Early dental imaging was slow, awkward, and so primitive that even a simple tooth picture looked like an experiment. On May 9, 1975, Nevsky Prospect filled with veterans marching through Leningrad for the 30th anniversary of victory. The crowd was so vast that the avenue looked less like a street and more like a living river of memory. In 1926, poor families in the Netherlands lived in turf huts built from sod because wood and stone were too costly. The walls kept heat in, but the homes needed constant patching with clay just to hold together. At the 1937 Paris World Fair, the German pavilion was placed directly across from the Soviet pavilion as a show of open rivalry. One photo captured the tension perfectly, with both sides turning architecture into a political stare down. In 1941, soldiers of the Volkhov Front built anti-tank barriers by hand on the Luga line as German forces pushed toward Leningrad. The photo is striking because these massive logs were part of a desperate race to stop tanks with muscle, mud, and time. In 1901, engineering crews near Hood River rebuilt rail lines by hand, using a tiny pushcart on the tracks. The scene looks simple, but it shows how early rail work depended on raw muscle in places where one mistake could stop the whole line. In 1917, loggers in California prepared to cut down a giant sequoia with a team of 10 mules. Some sequoias like this were thousands of years old before they were felled. In 1943, linotype operators at the Dallas Morning News cast whole lines of metal type to build each newspaper page. One machine could replace several hand compositors and changed newspaper printing speed. In the 1930s, a Somua street sweeper worked on Uritsky Square in Leningrad. Somua also built military vehicles, including the S-35 tank. In 1938, even women are shown buying perfume. The photo captures how trade goods like perfume reached remote northern communities. A Lakota man uses a surveyor's theodolite to track United States troops during the standoff at Wounded Knee. People in the camp also dug trenches for cover as federal forces closed in. In 1964, Tajik television cameraman Mansurov filmed flood damage in Aini while balancing on a narrow flooded structure. The photo was taken in the Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic after the flood. In 1972, a shepherd stands with a collective farm flock in Gundelin, in the Baksan district of Kabardino-Balkaria. Soviet collective farms could manage huge flocks like this as part of state-run agriculture. In 1895, Charles Rolls rode in a 4-horsepower Bali tricar with Al Paul seated in front. This was years before Rolls co-founded Rolls-Royce in 1906. In 1987, a traffic policeman in Baku stops a horse-drawn carriage in the middle of city traffic. The photo shows old transport and Soviet street policing side by side in one frame. On April 26, 1961, astronaut Gus Grissom trained for emergency water escape beside a Mercury capsule mock-up. He did this training just months before becoming the second American in space. In 1966, a Chinese Red Guard member led a mass rally in Chengdu against United States involvement in Vietnam. Red Guard rallies were a major part of the Cultural Revolution when students were mobilized for public political campaigns. On June 11, 1962, Alcatraz escapees left dummy heads in their beds to fool guards during their breakout. In 2013, police received a letter claimed to be from one of the men saying he had survived. In 1944, soldiers in Belgium crossed a destroyed bridge one by one while carrying full gear. Even outside direct combat, a single damaged crossing like this could kill men and stop an advance. On March 22, 1941, actor Jimmy Stewart took the oath as he entered the United States Army. He had just won the Academy Award for the Philadelphia Story before leaving Hollywood for military service. On June 26, 1953, Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell prepared to leave their handprints at Grauman's Chinese Theater. They were the two stars of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, released that same year. On March 17, 1937, Birmingham firefighters wore gas masks and protective suits during an anti-gas air raid drill. These exercises prepared crews for a feared chemical attack before the Second World War. This aircraft was shown as the Yeah-166, a fake designation used for record registration and deception. The name was applied to the Yeah-1521 for world records and later to the Yeah-152M as an intelligence ruse. In 1903, workers crossed the Carrick-a reed rope bridge at Ballantoy on a narrow plank path above the rocks. The bridge was used by fishermen reaching the small island to check and haul salmon nets. On March 20, 1922, USS Langley was commissioned as the first aircraft carrier of the United States Navy. The ship had originally been built as the collier USS Jupiter before it was converted for aircraft operations. In 1937, workers in Munich painted and assembled busts of Adolf Hitler in a factory. The Nazi regime produced these images in huge numbers for offices, schools, and public buildings. In the 1950s, Ramon Massats photographed bull running scenes in Pamplona as people sprinted through the streets beside live bulls. His images became some of the best-known visual records of post-war Spain. In 1905, Lombardi's opened in New York's Little Italy as the first licensed pizzeria in the United States. It helped turn pizza from an immigrant neighborhood food into a permanent part of American city life. This photo likely shows England in the 1930s with a coal cart horse drinking from a street trough. Horse troughs stayed in use long after the 18th and 19th centuries because working horses were still common in city transport. In May 1945, the crew of a Soviet IS-2 heavy tank watches a column of German prisoners in Berlin. The IS-2 was one of the Red Army's main heavy breakthrough tanks in the final battles of the war. In 1897, Scarborough Beach was crowded with sailing boats offshore and bathing huts lined up on the sand. The wheeled bathing huts were used as private changing rooms and could be rolled closer to the water. On April 20, 1944, the Dutch ship Voorbode exploded in Bergen with 120 tons of dynamite in its cargo. The blast destroyed large parts of the city center and killed more than 100 people. In May 1958, piles of British tanks, trucks, and armored vehicles stood in a Hamburg scrapyard after the war. Many of the machines used in the defeat of Germany were still waiting to be broken up more than a decade later. In 1895, miners at the Hubert Mine in Nevadaville, Colorado, were photographed about 850 feet underground. Hard rock miners worked in tight shafts like this to extract ore by hand and with blasting. In 1945, workers in Jerez de la Frontera labeled wine bottles by hand. Jerez is the city that gave sherry its name and was one of Spain's main wine centers. In 1943, a family returned to their home in the Smolensk region after the village was freed from German occupation. The woman is carrying an icon of St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker as they step back inside. This photo shows a Demonelix, the spiral fossil burrow of an extinct beaver-like animal found in Nebraska. These structures are about 20 to 23 million years old and were once mistaken for giant fossil sponges. On January 6, 1971, Tokyo firefighters performed traditional ladder balancing during the Dezo Meshi ceremony on Harumi Chuo Street. This was the 126th annual New Year Fire Service demonstration, a tradition dating back to the Edo period. In 1958, Italian cyclist Gaston Nencini drinks wine during the Tour de France. Riders of that era often used wine, beer, and other improvised fuel during long stages. In 1956, Hungarian children burned Soviet books and propaganda materials on Váci Street during the uprising in Budapest. The revolt began as a protest against Soviet control and was crushed by Soviet forces the same year. In 1913, a Turkish man prays before execution during the Balkan Wars. The Balkan Wars redrew borders in southeastern Europe and caused mass displacement and killings. In 1967, this rabbit was used in cancer research at the Tbilisi Institute of Oncology. The photo shows how live animals were used in laboratory experiments in the Soviet Union. In 1955, workers in Budapest walked to their jobs through an industrial district in the early morning. The photo shows how many people still reached factories on foot in post-war Eastern Europe. In June 1942, Seattle police officers wore gas masks during a civil defense drill. The exercise prepared them for a possible chemical attack during the Second World War. In April 1918, Australian soldiers buried Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, with full military honors after he was shot down behind Allied lines. He was credited with 80 air combat victories, the highest total of the First World War. In 1963, Formula One cars were loaded into an aircraft in London for transport to a race. Air freight was becoming important in motorsport because teams had to move cars and equipment quickly between countries. In 1916, a schoolboy in Reims wore a gas mask on his way to class during the First World War. Reims was heavily shelled during the war, so civilians had to live with constant danger. In 1945, Italian partisans in Milan posed with weapons during the final collapse of fascist rule in northern Italy. Partisan units helped seize cities and capture key fascist figures in the last days of the war. On August 26, 1941, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini visited Brest Fortress after its capture by German forces. The fortress had already become a major symbol of Soviet resistance because parts of its garrison kept fighting after the invasion began. In 1945, trucks of the United States 1,269th Engineer Combat Battalion crossed the Rhine on a floating bridge during the final push into Germany. The ruined tower in the background makes this real moment look almost unreal. In 1907, Bern University rejected Albert Einstein and treated his ideas as too radical. That makes this letter one of the most ironic papers in science history. In the early 1920s, American aid fed about 10 million starving people in Soviet Russia each day. More than 1 million of these food packages reached families, turning simple flour, rice, and milk into survival. One of Adolf Hitler's reported doubles was said to be his driver, seen standing just to his left in this photo. Some accounts even claim the body found at the end was not Hitler, but this man instead. In 1945, Avachinsky volcano on Kamchatka sent a giant ash cloud into the sky above the snow. The contrast is what makes this photo unforgettable. Frozen land below, raw force above. In 1959, a men's fashion show in Moscow drew a crowd that looked more like a major event than a runway. This photo shows how rare and fascinating modern style still felt in the Soviet Union. In 1938, a huge portrait turned Milan Cathedral into a political stage during a mass parade in Italy. The scale is the striking part here, with one face towering over an entire square full of people. In 1991, camels walked past Iraq's oil fields as huge clouds of smoke covered the sky during the Gulf War. It looks almost unreal because the desert feels silent while the horizon turns into pure darkness. In 1930, dekulakization stripped many peasant families of their homes, food, and property in the Soviet Union. This photo is chilling because a whole life is reduced to a few sacks and one silent moment. In 1948, a Sudeten German family expelled from Czechoslovakia begged on a street in Germany with a sign saying they had lost their home. The hardest detail is how their entire life fits into one cart. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, a British pilot taught a Soviet flyer to fly a Hurricane in the far north of the Soviet Union. This photo captures a rare Allied moment when help crossed language, weather, and borders. During Prohibition, smugglers tied sacks of salt or sugar to liquor crates and dropped them into the sea during inspections. When the sacks dissolved, the cargo rose back to the surface for pickup. On September 10, 1941, schoolboy Andrei Novikov gave an air raid warning in besieged Leningrad. The striking part is his age, because in that city, even children became part of survival. In May 1966, workers lifted a giant piece of Rameses II during the rescue of Abu Simbel. One of the most amazing facts is that an ancient temple was cut apart and moved to save it from rising water. In 1966, Jackie Stewart stayed right on Graham Hill's tail at the Nürburgring as both cars lifted off the road. The wild part is that this was real racing, on a track so fast and rough the cars could fly. In 1954, designers at the Gorky Auto Plant shaped the first full-size model of the Volga Gaz-21. This is the moment a future Soviet car icon still existed only in clay and sketches. In September 1918, American soldiers recovering from war trauma spent time fishing and swimming beside an old castle. The scene feels striking because even after the front, peace still had to be learned. In 1939, Adolf Hitler examined a car wheel at the Berlin Motor Show with almost childlike focus. The strange part is how a simple machine detail became a staged moment of power. In Paris in 1940, typists competed while blindfolded to prove pure speed and accuracy on the keyboard. The most striking part is that they had to trust only memory and touch. In 1949, Miss Italy drove Miss Sweden into the ropes during an international women's boxing match in Stockholm. The striking part is how fierce and modern this scene looks for its time. Viktor Savinik was one of 10 schoolboys arrested after they sent Stalin a letter asking why grain was being sent to Germany while Soviet people were starving. They were just 14 to 17 years old, but the court gave them 10 years in Kolyma for a supposed plot. In 1945, Berlin streets were lined with wrecked cars and shattered buildings after the final battles. The most striking detail is that people are already moving through the ruins, as if life had no time to stop. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945, Rudolf Hess and Joachim von Ribbentrop sat through a lunch break while Hermann Göring was seated in the center with his back to the camera. The unsettling part is how ordinary food and metal trays look beside men tied to crimes on a massive scale. Allied troops captured only 2 of these massive Krupp K5 railway guns, and each one could fire huge shells from miles away. The wild part is its scale, because this weapon looks more like a moving fortress than a gun. This was Stalin's near dacha, the house he moved to after his wife's death in the 1930s and the place where he later died. What makes it striking is how quiet and ordinary the building looks, despite the weight of history inside it. In August 1908, Winston Churchill appeared in a group photo with members of the Ancient Order of Druids. The image feels surreal because one future war leader is surrounded by figures who look almost mythic. In 1939, Adolf Hitler ate with officers during an inspection of the Siegfried Line near Aachen. The eerie part is how calm this lunch looks beside a frontier built for war. On September 27, 1941, a captured political officer called on Soviet troops to surrender near Petrozavodsk. The eerie part is that the message came from a trench, through a microphone and a record player. In the summer of 1941, Gudrun Himmler visited Dachau with her father, Heinrich Himmler. The chilling part is how this looks like an ordinary family moment beside one of the darkest places in Nazi Germany. In 1920, Albert Einstein was photographed at a picnic in Oslo, looking more like a quiet traveler than a world-famous mind. That is what makes this frame so striking. One of history's greatest thinkers sitting in the forest like an ordinary man. On June 25, 1941, Soviet KV-2 and T-34 tanks of the 4th Mechanized Corps ended up stuck in a drainage ditch near Radokiv. The brutal irony is that some of the strongest Soviet tanks were stopped not by battle, but by the land itself. This huge two-handed sword was linked to Pir Gerloff's Donia, the Frisian rebel and sea raider better known as Gruta Pir. The most striking fact is its size, because the blade looks less like a weapon and more like something from a legend. On July 4, 1940, soldiers posed for photos on the terrace of the Palais de Chaillot with the Eiffel Tower behind them. The unsettling part is how easily Paris had already turned into a backdrop for occupation. In 1955, Marlon Brando and Marilyn Monroe were caught in one rare frame at the peak of their fame. The photo feels electric because 2 of the biggest faces of old Hollywood are laughing like old friends. At the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, these timekeepers worked at the first games to use partly automatic timing and photo finish. This photo catches the exact moment sport began turning into measured science. In 1954, Operation Snowball trained Soviet troops to move and fight in atomic conditions near Orenburg. The image looks unreal because the soldiers seem to come from another world, not a military exercise. In 1899, Winston Churchill served with the South African Light Horse during the Boer War. The striking part is how young he looks here, long before he became one of the most famous leaders of the 20th century. Sandy Allen held the Guinness record as the world's tallest woman and became famous for her extraordinary height. She later used that attention to support people with similar conditions and speak at schools. While we're watching these shots, write in the comments which one you like the most and why. British troops turned the tail of a shot down Luftwaffe Bf-110 into a rough bar on the African front. The wild part is how fast wreckage from war became a table for drinks. In early 1917, the 4 daughters of Tsar Nicholas II shaved their heads after measles caused severe hair loss. The photo feels haunting because the future Grand Duchesses look almost unrecognizable. In 1970, Ethel Kennedy stood at Robert F. Kennedy's grave on the 2nd year after his death. The photo feels deeply quiet because grief here says more than any crowd ever could. In 1906, Otabenga was displayed at the Bronx Zoo beside primates after being taken from the Congo and sold for a pound of salt. The most disturbing fact is that thousands came to stare at him as if he were not human. On March 24, 1976, Argentina's military removed President Isabel Perón in a coup. This photo captures the moment power changed hands and the country entered one of its darkest periods. In 1989, ACT UP protesters demonstrated at Trump Tower and directly called out Donald Trump in public. The photo feels sharp and raw because protest, anger, and spectacle collide in one frame. In 1988, Lars Løkke Rasmussen was photographed in Afghanistan beside Mujahideen fighters. The striking part is how this looks less like the future career of a Danish prime minister and more like a lost frame from a war film. On March 31, 1930, Babe Ruth posed outside the Menger Hotel before a New York Yankees exhibition game in San Antonio. The striking part is how calm he looks, as if baseball's biggest star had simply stepped out for fresh air. On the African front, Royal Italian Army soldiers worked a Breda 20x65 automatic cannon in the open desert. The striking part is how small the crew looks behind a weapon built to throw fast fire across empty land. In 1936, Louis Armstrong was already one of the biggest names in jazz, and his trumpet had changed popular music. What makes this photo so striking is how calm he looks before the sound that shook the world. In 1954, Marilyn Monroe spent a relaxed family moment with Tom DiMaggio, while Joe DiMaggio appears in just one frame. The rare part is seeing Hollywood's brightest star in such an ordinary home scene. After the fall of Bataan, Japanese soldiers and local civilians posed with a captured American M3 Stuart tank on Luzon. The striking part is how fast a battlefield trophy turned into a photo scene. Japanese soldiers try on Type 95 gas masks in a field shelter, turning a quiet moment into something deeply strange. The most striking part is how the masks erase every face and make the scene feel almost unreal. On March 23, 1926, Buster Keaton and Roscoe Arbuckle got out of Yosemite by train after closed roads blocked them. The wild part is that the road sergeant who let them through lost his job for it. In 1916, soldiers on the Galician front marked this dugout as Heim Esperanto, turning a wartime shelter into a small sign of a universal language. The most striking part is that even in the trenches, some people still believed one shared language could unite the world. Paul's Chapel was built in 1766 and is the oldest surviving church building in New York City. The striking part is that this quiet church has stood through revolution, fire, collapse, and the rise of the modern skyline. In 1977 to 1978, pro-Derg youths in Ethiopia marched with portraits of Stalin, Lenin, and Marx. The striking part is how far Soviet symbols had traveled, from Europe to a mass rally in Africa. William McKinley and Daniel Lucas Cruz lived for years as hermit brothers near the Okefenokee Swamp, far from modern life. The most striking part is that William feared electricity along with God, the devil, and women. In 1948, Japanese escort ships were being cut apart for scrap, turning wartime vessels into steel, and silence. The striking part is how fast machines built for battle became leftovers of a lost empire. On November 8, 1919, crowds gathered as Germany's new republic was announced in public. The striking part is the hope in this moment, because people still believed a new system could finally bring peace. In the 1880s, an owled nail woman from Algeria was photographed covered in layers of gold and silver jewelry. The striking part is that her clothes look less like fashion and more like a portable treasure. In 1880, an Ottoman mother rested her head on the grave of her daughter Fatma, who had died at just 19. The heartbreaking part is that even 3 years later, her grief still feels visible in one silent pose. On March 24, 1926, Sam Jarvis and H.W.D. Foster posed at a skating carnival in Toronto as Antony and Cleopatra. This photo shows how big costume ice shows were in the 1920s. In 1935, this photo showed a huge stucco mask on Pyramid K5 at the ancient Maya city of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. The mask was made between about 600 and 850 and was still visible when archaeologists photographed it. On March 23, 1926, Cushman Dam No. 1 began sending power to Tacoma without any public ceremony. 2 months later, President Calvin Coolidge officially opened it by pressing a remote button from the White House. On March 23, 1955, the ESS underground nuclear test was carried out at the Nevada test site at a depth of 20 meters. The blast was 1.2 kilotons and left a crater 91 meters wide and 39 meters deep. In 1965, the Tanger Shriners picked up matching Corvette Stingray convertibles in St. Louis. At that time, St. Louis was the city where Corvettes were built. More than 20,000 West Indian men volunteered to serve in the First World War. Of them, 15,600 served in the British West Indies Regiment. Kathleen Drew Baker was an English scientist whose seaweed research helped make modern nori farming possible. Japan still honors her every April 14th, even though she never visited the country. In the 1920s, Clara Bow arrived at a train station in Chicago at the height of her fame. She grew up in poverty and became one of the biggest stars of silent films. On March 24, 1958, Elvis Presley reported to the Memphis Draft Board at 6:35 in the morning. He was then taken with 12 other recruits to Kennedy Veterans Memorial Hospital and given Army serial number. In 1930, Gary Cooper posed on the set of The Texan in full costume. The film was one of his early Western roles before he became one of Hollywood's biggest stars. In the early 1930s, this couple became famous for covering most of their bodies with tattoos. At that time, people like them were often shown in sideshows and drew huge crowds. This is Hedy Lamarr, the actress once widely called one of the most beautiful women in the world. She later became famous not only for films, but also for co-inventing a radio guidance system that helped inspire modern wireless technology. By 1935, the Civilian Conservation Corps had put hundreds of thousands of young men to work across the United States. They built parks, planted billions of trees, fought forest fires, and sent most of their $30 monthly pay home to their families. On March 24, 1945, paratroopers of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment moved out near Wessel after landing during Operation Varsity. Operation Varsity was one of the biggest airborne assaults of the war. 14-year-old Pyotr Gurko received the Medal for Courage in the Pskov-Novgorod partisan zone on July 30, 1942. This photo shows a real wartime award being pinned to a child. In Kharkiv in 1933, a soldier guarded grain taken from Ukrainian peasants during the famine. One frame shows the cruel contrast of hunger outside and food locked behind armed control. This common room at the Rural Folk University in Sais shows how village students in Poland studied, read, and met together in 1930. The quiet room feels modern in a surprising way for a rural school almost 100 years ago. Lieutenant General Du Yuming was captured on January 10, 1949, one day after his 26th Division Force collapsed. This image freezes the exact moment a top commander went from leading an army to standing as a prisoner. During Iwo Jima in 1945, United States Marines received Holy Communion from a Marine chaplain between combat scenes. The photo becomes even more striking when you know this battle cost nearly 7,000 Marine lives. In spring 2024, a new lunar crater about 225 meters wide suddenly appeared on the Moon. NASA said impacts this large are so rare that one can happen only about once in a century. Bernauer Street in Berlin became one of the most famous borderlines of the Cold War after the wall split homes and streets apart. This photo shows how an ordinary city block was turned into a hard barrier almost overnight. In the 1970s, Zhiguli cars rolled into Leningrad, stacked on rail wagons above the street. It is a strange everyday scene where brand new cars seem to float over city traffic. Chernobyl did not shut down after the 1986 accident, and the station kept working for 14 more years. Because of an energy crisis, its last reactor stopped only in 2000. In 1877, scoliosis treatment could mean being strapped into a full-body suspension frame like this. The photo looks shocking now, but it shows how far medicine went before modern spine care existed. In 1890, this woman posed openly with a leg prosthesis at a time when such devices were still rare and heavy. One photo quietly shows how people were rebuilding their lives long before modern prosthetics existed. In the early 1900s, magnetic therapy was presented as a modern treatment, and patients sat wired to large electrical devices like this. The scene feels strange now because early medicine often looked half clinic and half experiment. In the 1950s, machines like this were used to boost blood flow in the legs with changing air pressure. The photo looks futuristic, but it was real medical care for poor circulation. In Leningrad in 1932, women in the felt worker Artel made Valenki by hand in a rolling workshop. This photo shows how simple winter boots came from hard manual work, not machines. In Berlin in May 1929, this photo caught women buying banned cocaine from a street dealer known as Coca-Meal. One frame shows how bold and visible the city underworld had become before the crash of the 1930s. In March 1942, a Japanese sentry stood guard in Bacolod with an Arisaka rifle after an air raid left the street in ruins. The scene feels eerily still because one lone soldier is framed by fresh destruction. In the USSR in 1989, one store window bluntly said dishes could not be washed because there was no water. Another sign sold beer only into the buyer's own container, turning everyday shopping into a quiet portrait of shortage. In December 1942, Vasily Zaitsev and sniper students from the 284th Rifle Division moved through ruined Stalingrad to an ambush position. This photo shows how the shattered city itself became their cover. On May 2, 1945, Soviet troops took full control of Berlin after one of the biggest final battles in Europe. This street shows what the fall of the German capital looked like in real time. In Baku in 1943, locomotive driver Gulyam Gasanova stood in uniform beside her steam engine. When men left for the front, women took over jobs like this and kept the railways moving. In 1943, villagers came back after liberation and found only rubble where their home had stood. One photo shows the cost of war more clearly than pages of history. In Sevastopol in 1942, the Lenin Monument was blown apart during the occupation and only the base remained. The image feels surreal because the statue seems to sink into the ruined city behind it. In 1942, German prisoners captured south of Voronezh were marched under Red Army Guard. The women watching from the roadside turned this war scene into something painfully human. In 1936, dust storms in the Texas Panhandle turned open roads into walls of moving earth. This was part of the Dust Bowl, when broken prairie soil let the wind remake the sky itself. In Los Angeles in 1933, a car smashed straight into the front of a flower shop. The crash feels surreal because twisted metal stopped in the middle of buckets of fresh blooms. In 1865, Charleston stood in ruins after years of Civil War bombardment. The shattered church and empty streets show how a proud city was reduced to a shell. On June 30, 1937, Japanese chorus girls practiced military-style drills on a theater roof. The image feels startling because stage performers were moving with the discipline of soldiers. Founded on March 21, 1381, Laleski marked its 550th year with this monument in 1931. After the war, the same stone was moved, stripped of its German text, and given a completely new meaning. This young Ouled nailwoman from Algeria was photographed in the early 1900s wearing the coin jewelry that made her community instantly recognizable. Her direct smile makes the portrait feel unusually alive for a studio image more than a century old. In Nome in 1905, a group of Inupiat people posed in a car when automobiles were still a rare sight in Alaska. The photo captures a brief moment when new technology met one of the far north's oldest communities. In 1912, passengers on the Cunard liner Franconia could already use a gym with a punch bag and an early cycling machine. The photo feels even stranger when you know this ship was gone just 4 years later. In Seminole, Oklahoma, in 1939, a truck driver sits with his mother and young son beside the family radio. One quiet room holds 3 generations and the everyday face of the Great Depression. On February 16, 1945, paratroopers of the 503rd PRCT waited inside a C-47 just before the jump over Corregidor. Their faces show the exact second when fear and adrenaline looked almost the same. In Tom Green County, Texas, in 1939, a dairy worker strained fresh milk into rows of metal cans at an industrial plant. One photo turns ordinary milk into a flood of white, showing how huge food processing already looked before the modern age. On March 24, 1945, more than 16,000 British and American paratroopers dropped east of the Rhine in Operation Varsity. This was the biggest single-day airborne assault in history. In late October 1944, 2 Dutch girls wrote messages on a Sherman tank of the 1st Polish Armored Division after Breda was freed. The tanks became moving message boards, carrying news of safety from town to town. Born in 1845, Karl Glockner fought in the Franco-Prussian War and lived until 1953. One man saw Germany move from horse carts to jets and from empire to ruins. In Sarajevo in 1912, this woman was photographed showing the traditional tattoos worn by some Catholic women in Bosnia. Her calm stare makes the image feel strikingly modern despite being more than a century old. During the Blitz, air raids turned great British churches into open-roofed shells of stone and glass. This ruin shows how one night of bombing could leave a centuries-old building standing like a skeleton. In Tom Green County, Texas in 1939, a dairy worker strained fresh milk by hand into heavy metal cans. This simple job fed whole towns before plastic cartons and automated lines took over. In Black River Falls in 1937, a farm family sat together on one bed inside their plain wooden home. This single room says a lot about how tightly families lived through hard years. In 1987, Soviet cosmonauts trained in sea rescue gear before missions to the Mir station. Space crews had to prepare for the ocean too, because a landing could end far from land. In the 1960s, mobile grocery trucks brought food to remote Soviet fields where no regular shops existed. This photo shows a whole store arriving on wheels, right where people worked. In Barcelona in 1937, Fanny Schoenheit was photographed by the sandbags of Hotel Colón during the Spanish Civil War. Known as the Queen of the Machine Gun, she became one of the most striking foreign volunteers in the fight. Around 1900, Three breaker boys posed outside the Woodward coal mines in Kingston, Pennsylvania. They look playful, but these were working children in one of the hardest jobs of the industrial age. At the first state bearing plant, artist Sergei Grigoriev painted the portrait of honored smith Panteleimon Shemyakin right inside the forge shop. The scene is striking because factory labor and official art meet in the same moment. Karl Bulla, a race winner in St. Petersburg, posed with his bicycle sometime between 1895 and 1913. His medal-covered jersey makes this early sports portrait feel proud, sharp, and surprisingly modern. In 1920, children who had taken First Communion walked through Honda Ribia in the Corpus Christi procession. The long white line makes one quiet street feel almost unreal. On June 19, 1937, Carlist militiaman Benito Martinez Albero was photographed on the streets of Bilbao. His calm pose and worn gear make the war feel suddenly close and real. Elizabeth Falkenrath went from hairdresser to camp guard and later became one of the most feared women in the Nazi camp system. This photo is chilling because it shows how an ordinary face could stand inside one of history's darkest machines. Thanks for watching. If you are close to such rare historical photos, subscribe. They are published here every day.